Thank you everybody for joining. My name is Becky Graham. I am a final semester MLIS student. My focus is on e-learning and digital accessibility, and my current position is Senior Copy Editor and Accessibility Assistant at the Geese College of Business e-learning office at UIUC. Today's presentation was originally supposed to be at the OER Access Adoption and Application Conference, which, like everything else, has been canceled due to COVID. But I thought the information was really important and I wanted the opportunity to share that. So let's start with what is accessibility. Before we can talk about how to select or create accessible files, we need to make sure we all know what it is that we're talking about. So if you have an idea of what accessibility means, go ahead and stick that in the chat. Yeah, exactly. So the idea being that all of our students, all of our users are able to access and use the materials we provide to them, or as someone mentioned, at least as many as possible. There are a bunch of different definitions that people use for accessibility. For this presentation, I want to keep in mind that what we're talking about is the degree to which a product, a file, a device is available and usable to as many people as possible. And we're specifically going to talk about students or users with disabilities, but all of these things have overlap that make files more usable for our quote unquote regular students as well. So regardless of ability, designing your electronic or digital files with these features in mind is going to make the better user experience for all of your students. So digital accessibility specifically is the extent to which a digital object, so your video lectures, your audio files, your documents, ebooks, web content, your learning management system, the extent to which that is actually accessible and usable to students with a variety of different needs. We're going to focus on screen reader compatibility, captions, and navigation, but it's not limited to these concerns, and we will touch on some other things that you can design for. So before we go any further, I want to make sure that everyone understands the difference between an accessibility and an accommodation. So accommodation is something that's done after the fact, per request, on a single user basis. So essentially the student has to either contact the professor or contact a disability office of some sort and request a specific accommodation because whatever file they need, they can't access. Accessibility, on the other hand, is kind of built in. It's available upfront to everyone without a need to request. Accommodation really gives the idea of a deficit mindset. It's saying that, well, all of my other students can use the file the way it is. You're the one that has to have this special thing. And we don't want to do that. We want to send the idea that all of our students are valued and equal, and we want to provide equitable access to our materials. So who uses these accessible items? Who are we designing for? Non-sighted and low vision users, so users who might be using screen readers. Deaf or hard of hearing users, people who are going to need captions for your videos or transcripts. Autistic users and users with sensory processing disorders. A lot of times it can be a lot easier for those students to have kind of a flat transcript version of a video rather than a video that's maybe too loud, maybe too bright, maybe too fast. Users with mobility or fine motor skill impairment. So we're going to talk a little bit about navigation and making sure your files can be navigated both by keyboard and mouse so that people with different levels of motor skill are able to use the same files. Colorblind users, users with other learning or cognitive issues, ADD, ADHD, dyslexia. These are all people who can benefit from some of the particular accessibility features we're going to talk about. And then really just all of your students. When it comes to navigation, those formatting styles that allow for navigation also provide a more visually understandable document that all of your students are going to prefer. Videos that have captions can be used by just a ton of different students in different situations, whether it's, everyone's learning from home right now, so maybe the toddler's taking a nap and you really need to keep the sound down on your video. Captions allow you to do that. Under normal circumstances, captions are great for watching videos in a quiet library setting. So it really goes so far beyond just students who have accessibility needs. So why does accessibility matter? Well, first and foremost, it is the law, and you will be sued if your materials are not properly accessible. ADA and the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 are kind of the main laws under which you might see litigation. Essentially, what they both say are that any student with a disability is not to be excluded, denied the benefit of, subject to any sort of discrimination for any program or product provided by a public, private, nonprofit. Between the two laws, pretty much anywhere you're going to be working in a library or teaching students, it's going to apply to you. So what we say, or what we mean when we say that a student's not denied the benefit of a learning material, that means that they're getting as close as possible to the same learning experience. So if you have captions, they need to be accurate. They need to be presenting exactly the same information that a sighted or audio learner is going to be getting. Section 508 is especially important to digital accessibility. That specifies that electronic and information technology has to be accessible to people with disabilities, and it has to work with their assistive technology. And then the FCC has issued some mandates about captions. They have to accurately express the speaker's exact words. They need to have at least a 99% accuracy rate in terms of spelling, punctuation, and grammar. And they need to be timed in a way that they aren't too quick for the viewer to read, but that they do match up with the words being spoken. So you need to think about that also when you're filming your videos. You have to pace your speech so that the captions can match up to your words and still be slow enough for people to read. The other reason, especially that I find to be very important to aim for accessibility and not accommodation, is accommodation requires disclosure. In order to make an accommodation by request, that student has to disclose their disability status. And not only do they have to disclose, but that usually means they have to get medical forms, so they have to pay for the doctor's visit, usually pay for the doctor to fill out the form, and those forms need to be updated every academic year. So all of that on top of when the student makes the request, by the time it goes through the process, and whether the disability office or the professor themselves has to make an accessible version and gets back to the student, they might end up a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks behind the rest of the class waiting for those materials. Please design accessibly from the beginning. Don't make your students ask for it. So if I'm asking you to design and select accessible materials, we need to know what that even means. So there are guidelines and standards. The WCAG 2.1 is the most current set of standards put out by the World Wide Web Consortium. They have kind of a 3-tier A, AA, AAA ratings. The A level is kind of the really bare minimums. You want to aim for AA, that's industry standard, and then the AAA is really that gold star above and beyond. And you can go to the website and kind of read through the different levels, but I'll give you a good example with that in terms of captions. So a single A level caption is just captions exist. They are there. There are words on the screen. AA level captions meet all of those FCC mandates. So they're properly timed, they're accurate, they've been copy edited. AAA videos might provide captions as well as an ASL translator on top of the video. That's great if you can provide that. I think most of us are probably teaching in places where we can't come up with an ASL translator. But that's why it's a 3rd-tier level. Like if that's something that you can do, absolutely do it. But if it's not, make sure that you're meeting that AA standard. And these guidelines are based on the poor understanding. So you want to make sure that your content is perceivable, meaning that it's available in multiple formats. It can be perceived by non-sighted or non-hearing students, by colorblind students, that your files are operable, they're usable and navigatable by a variety of people on a variety of devices, that your content is understandable, that your visuals and audio descriptions are concise and complete, that your graphs and figures are understandable in their current format, properly labeled, the data is properly portrayed, it's not represented only by color, and we'll look at that in a bit, and that it's robust. You really want to utilize all the available features for whatever file type or platform you're working on. The basic standards for a text document, you need to have clearly labeled and tagged headings. So that's a title, a heading 1, a heading 2, and in a few slides I'm going to walk you through kind of how to do that in a Word document. But essentially the goal here is that students who are using screen readers or students who need to navigate via their keyboard, they need to be able to go from one heading to the next, and they need the screen reader to clearly tell them where they are within the document. So what a screen reader will do when it gets to a labeled heading is it will say, heading 1, and then read the text, heading 2, and read the text. And there are shortcut keys so that when a student is, say, coming back to review a document and they know they just need something in that 4th paragraph, they can skip from heading to get to that information. But if it's not properly labeled, then they just have to sit there and essentially listen to the entire document until they get to the point of the sentence they needed. For lists and tables, I know a lot of us like to use lists and tables because they look nice. Only use them when they're actually necessary and useful. So don't put bullet points on every one of your slides if what's on your slide is not actually a list of items. Same thing with tables. Don't use a table unless what you're putting in it is actually meant to be in a table. If it's really data, if it's something that can't be described or presented in another way. And I say this because of the way screen readers handle lists and tables. So with a list, when a screen reader comes to it, it's going to say, the following is a list of 6 items, and then whatever text. And it's going to say bullet item 1 and the text, bullet item 2, bullet item 3. So for a student who can't visually see your slide, A, they have to listen to all of that, which maybe isn't necessary if the things in it aren't really a list. And B, they're going to be trying to figure out what is relating these items, why they're all part of the same list. And if they're not actually part of the same list, you've just added quite a bit of cognitive load that wasn't necessary for your students. Kind of the same with tables. A screen reader is going to navigate that and it's going to read it out as column 1, row 1, and then the text, column 2, row 2, and the text. So if it's not something that has to be in columns and rows, you're adding a lot of extra things for your non-sighted students. When it comes to hyperlinks, and I've got an example here next to the color contrast, you don't want to list your full URL. You want to embed the URL into a very short statement that shows where the link is taking the students. So if you think about, as a visual person, the way that you quote unquote read or don't read a URL when you see one, you don't sit there and say http://. No, you look at it very briefly to figure out where it's going to take you and you click it and you move on. For a screen reader user, they don't have that option if you don't embed the link. They have to sit there and listen to the whole link be read out, and then they have to figure out which piece of that was actually where this link is taking me. And on top of that, navigating with a screen reader is very difficult. So if you're kicking them into another window and they don't know what's in that window or whether or not they actually want to go there, you're causing a lot of extra work for them to try and get back to the document that they were in. Always embed your links, don't put in URLs. When you're choosing visuals, you don't want to just put things in for decorative purposes. There's a question, hang on. Lisa asks if there's a way to have the URLs print if they aren't displayed for those that need a print version. Another way to handle that might be to embed the link as usual, and then in a footer, perhaps, provide the actual full URL. So one of the things that we do at the e-learning office is we have the references in a footer at the bottom of our documents. So the actual in-text up on the slide item is embedded, but then it links down to a reference in the footer that has the full citation. Thank you for asking that. So for color contrast, I'm going to stop the share screen and switch over to this really neat tool that I want to show you called Coblis. It's colorblindness.com, and it's a tool to check and make sure the images and graphs that you're using are going to be accessible for students that have colorblind difficulties. This is an actual slide from a course that I am working on right now. Just trust me, it's an economics graph that makes perfect sense to the economics professor and hopefully the students who take this class. But what I wanted to show you is you can upload an image, any image that you're working on, and you can click through these different types of color blindness and see how your students are going to perceive that graph. So if possible, you want to use colors so that when you click through here, it's understandable for every one of these types of students. Like this one, this isn't great, but the graph is already designed and I can't change that. So what I can do is when I'm providing visual description for this graph, I'm going to describe it in a way that doesn't rely on the color. I'm going to talk about, this section above PM, the section below PM, the section to the left of the MR line, to the right of the MR line. If a student can't tell the difference between the blue section and the yellow section, they'll still be able to understand the graph. I want to talk about fonts very quickly. You want to make sure that you are using sans serif. That's going to make things much easier for students with dyslexia. And you want to make sure that for a slideshow, especially if it's going to be in a recorded video, that your heading or title font is at least a 32 and that your text is at least a 24. Think about the number of your students who are going to have to watch that video on a mobile device. You want to make sure that text is big enough for them to see it on the smaller screen. And also just students who maybe have a hard time with small text, make it big enough. Don't make them struggle for it. Visuals, we talked about color contrast, but also you want to make sure all of your visuals serve a purpose and that you can provide a visual description of that item. So for example, I have this little icon. This icon isn't really necessary, but it serves the purpose of showing you visual description. It's just a very concise, simple sentence. There's an icon of a text document. So if a student who is non-sighted is using a screen reader to get through the text of this slide, it's going to pop over and tell them that there's an image, and then it's going to read the description for them. And then finally, mostly because I am a copy editor, please make sure you copy edit all of your materials. Things like spelling and grammar are incredibly important when you consider a screen reader is only going to read the text that you have actually put in. If it's misspelled, if it's the incorrect word, that's what the student's going to get. When it comes to captions, if a student cannot hear your vocal pauses, then the placement of your commas and periods is incredibly important. It's the only context they have, and a misplaced comma can drastically change the meaning of your sentence. So please copy edit your materials. And right along with that, when you are making a video, you need to have captions and transcripts. So captions are the text that appear on the screen while the video is playing. A transcript is usually a downloadable but a full text version of those captions that can be read separately or along with the video. Your color contrast, fonts, and visuals, all the things we talked about for text documents, those need to be checked before you start filming the video. Once you've filmed the video, it is too late to go back and fix your font size or your color contrast without starting over. So you want to do all of that before you start filming. So I'm going to put that link to the Google Drive folder back in the chat. If you want to go ahead and open that up and follow along, we're going to take a look at the accessibility checklist, and it's something we've been working on at the Geese e-learning office. And I wanted to share it with you guys because I think it's incredibly important, and it's a really easy way that you can take this with you, download it, and use it whenever you're selecting or creating materials. So this is basically the very simplest versions of those 2.1 guidelines put into a checklist that you can keep with you when you're creating or selecting materials. So it goes through heading styles. Are they consistently used? Are they in the right order? Have you actually used the heading styles and not just made your text bold? So I will show you how to do that in a Word document in a little bit. Lists, links, tables, fonts, images, all of the things we've talked about are in this file for you, including a link to that code list tool. So if you didn't get it and all you have, you just download this document, you'll have that link and you can follow that and use it when you're making your materials. Just keep in mind that as long as you understand what the checklist is asking you to look for, you can use this to check, and it's going to at least meet that AA standard for your materials. So now that you have an idea about what to look for to decide if something is accessible or not, I'm going to walk you through the very basics of how to create an accessible document, how to select an accessible document, so how to use that checklist to make sure something that you're about to purchase is going to be accessible, and then what to do if it's not accessible. So when you're creating accessible videos, remember, you want to do as much of this before you start filming as possible. So make sure you assess your full slide deck before recording the video. While you're recording, you want to make sure that you're using clear location speech. So for example, avoid saying, click here. That's not helpful for someone who can't see your screen. Instead, you want to say, go to File in the upper left corner, select Save. It'll be the third item down on the list. And whenever possible, verbally explain the different visual components on your slides or scenes of your video. So if you have, for example, a pie chart that talks about demographics, you don't need to read every sliver of that pie chart and the data that goes with it, but you should say something like, you know, as you can see, 75% of students are whatever. And then if you're going into 2 or 3 items on that pie graph, then go ahead and address those. That's going to be very helpful for students who can't see the slides, but also when you go back and do your captions, when you do your visual description, having that information already verbally there is going to be helpful for you. As you're filming or editing, keep it to basic transitions. You know, you don't need star swipes in the middle of your video, and avoid audio only elements like intro music or, you know, wacky sound effects if they aren't pertinent to what you're actually teaching. When it comes to captions, take advantage of those AI captioning software, but you have to go back and edit those captions. The e-learning team that I work with, the research assistants, are working on a paper right now where we have looked at accuracy rates for AI captions, and they do not meet minimum standards. If you don't go back and edit those captions, you are not providing accessible videos, and you are not meeting the minimums in terms of legality. So there was a recent litigation against Harvard on this. You have to go back and edit those captions. And then whenever possible, provide your students with a downloadable version of that full text transcript. At the e-learning office, we really provide like a full range in terms of HTML files, EPUBs, PDFs. We have still frames from the videos along with the text. You don't have to do all of that, but at least provide a downloadable version of the transcript document. So when you're creating accessible text documents, the file formats that you want to work with are Word, HTML, and EPUB. If you have the tech skills to create and edit EPUBs and HTML, I would recommend that. They are more accessible than Word documents, But if you don't, you can make a AA standard accessible document using Word. If you can, avoid PDF if possible. They are not good with screen readers. If you have to use PDF, then you want to make sure your headings are clearly tagged, and any visual description or alternative text is going to have to be pulled out and put below the image as a visual description, like I did on those slides with the icons. So industry standard is actually to embed your alternate text into the image. PDF is a flat document. It's not going to read that, well, it's almost never going to read that embedded alt text. Sometimes you get lucky, typically you don't. So pull it out, put it underneath where you would put a caption. And I'm going to walk you through how to make these accessible changes within Word. And we're going to look at headings and alt text, and I'll show you how to use the accessibility checker. Before I get into showing you how to change the style for titles and headings, you might be thinking the same thing I was thinking before I really learned anything about digital accessibility, which is, why would anybody ever use these styles up here when they could just make it bold and change the size, right? That's what 90% of us did all through K-12 whenever we made Word documents. The reason that you want to use these pre-formatted styles is because they provide contextual information embedded in the text that screen readers use to let students know where they are. So if you go up to the menu bar and go to Design, you can choose the design that you like the most. And once we format it, you'll be able to see how that changes the way the document looks. So under Home, and then in the middle, you've got that Styles bar. You can choose a title. You highlight Heading 1. You can highlight Heading 2. That's all there is to it. You've just made properly formatted screen reader accessible headings in about 2 seconds. Super easy. So when you go back to design now, you can scroll through and see all the different ways that those headings are formatted so that you can pick the one that works the best visually for your students and for your content. And we'll go back to home. When you're back to just the paragraphs that go in between your headings, you do want to make sure that's selected as normal. Again, that's going to put some contextual information for your students who are using screen readers to let them know that they're at a paragraph and not a new heading. So again, this is actual slide from a course that we are working on at the e-learning office. So I'm going to show you how to embed the alt text and then how to pull the visual description out and put it underneath, say if you need it to convert this into a PDF. So to embed, you're just going to right click on the image, and there is Edit Alt Text. Now, visually describing something takes a lot of practice. You want it to be concise and clear and complete without being too wordy, and it's very subjective. For something like this, I would just say there are 3 concentric circles labeled from the outside to the inside as macro environment, industry environment, and the firm. So for a student who can't see that slide, you're telling them what is on the slide, what it's labeled, and then the transcript is going to give them some context on what that actually means. And that's it. That you have alt text now. It was that simple. To pull it out and have it listed below, you right click on the image and insert a caption. And I'm just going to paste in that exact same text and click OK. And that's going to show up below. So in this case, if you wanted students to be able to print it and still have a visual description of what it is they're looking at, or if you were going to convert this to a PDF, I would recommend using the caption feature so that it is not hidden inside the image. For your hyperlinks, so this is what we talked about, you don't want this full URL. Instead, we would highlight the text that shows where that link is going, right-click and click Link, paste that URL into the address bar at the bottom and click OK, and you have an embedded link. The last thing I want to show you is the accessibility checker. So at the menu bar under Review, there is a check accessibility feature, and you click that, and this passes. What this is checking for is appropriate headings. It's looking for proper color contrast, that your images have either alt text or a caption. Anytime that you're working with a Word document, you can run that accessibility checker and it'll give you a pop-up that says, hey, check your color contrast, or you've got an image on page 3 that doesn't have any alt text. The other good thing about starting in Word is you can file save as, and that will convert it to either an HTML or a PDF. If you're going to convert to HTML, you need to know how to edit HTML because it's not going to give you a proper title or language tag. Everything else seems to work fine. So if you have enough HTML knowledge that you can add a title and language tag, then you can make your things in Word and convert them over to HTML, and it should be fine. So what about selecting something? If you are not creating it, if it's someone else's work, how do you know if it's accessible? So again, use that checklist. Review those guidelines. Pull up the item before you decide to assign it to students, before you download it and put it up on the course website, and run it through that checklist. Test it out. If you have access to a screen reader, that's a great way to test. If you don't, there are plenty of free in-browser text-to-speech programs. So you can open the document and use one of those text-to-speech programs and listen to what a screen reader user would hear. And you'd be able to say, okay, this is good, this isn't, this needs to be fixed. A great idea is to read any visual descriptions and read the full transcript without looking at the video, without looking at the images. If you can read the visual description without seeing the image and it makes sense, that's a good visual description. If you don't get the point of it without looking at it, it needs to be fixed. Some other tools. So Axe is a great accessibility extension on Chrome. I don't know that it's available as an extension in other browsers, but for Chrome, any HTML file, any web content, anything that you're opening in your Chrome browser, if you have the Axe extension, and you can just Google Axe, it'll take you right to the download for that. You right-click, go to Inspect, and then there will be an Axe accessibility checker within that inspection box, and it will show you exactly what and where there are any issues that might cause a screen reader difficulty, for example. For EPUBs, DAISY is really kind of the bar for EPUB accessibility, and they have an EPUB check and ACE, which is the accessibility checker. ACE can be downloaded into your EPUB editor, so if you are editing or creating EPUB files, ACE is kind of that last step accessibility checker in the same way that the Word accessibility checker works. And then finally, ebook audit report. If you follow that link, it's going to take you to what looks like kind of a complex Excel sheet, but once you kind of work with it, it's a really great tool. This was created by crowdsourcing from librarians who tested a whole bunch of e-reader platforms and formats and vendors, and provided essentially a ranking list of which ones are most accessible and which ones have issues. And as far as I know, it does get updated as vendors or publishers make their materials more accessible. So if you're looking for maybe purchasing for a collection for your library and you need to check and see how accessible a particular vendor or publisher is, ebook audit report is a great place to go for that. So what about those items that don't meet accessibility standards? So you have this really great OA or OER, and it's just not accessible, but you really want it. So what do? Well, first, if it is OA, OER, the great thing about that is you can adapt it. So if it is in a PDF, switch it to Word. If you have Adobe Pro, they make that pretty easy for you. If not, download PDF SAM. It's a free, very easy to use, intuitive software, and it does file conversions very easily. So you can convert, say, from an EPUB to a PDF if you needed to. You can convert from PDF to Word and it really just is upload the file, tell it what you want it to do, it does it. Once it's in Word, then you can use those accessibility features to make it more accessible. If you're going to be working with HTML or EPUBs, again, you're going to need to know more of the back-end coding for that, but I would recommend Sigil or Calibre for EPUB editors, Dreamweaver, if you can get access to it. It's pretty pricey as an HTML editor, but it's very robust. If not, you can do it all in Notepad++. You just have to really know how to do the HTML code. So I'm not going to get into HTML coding here, but that is a large part of what I do in my position with the e-learning office. So if that's something you're interested in, I'd be happy to give you more information on that. What about things you can't adapt? So there are a ton of copyrighted journal articles, ebooks that just really aren't very accessible. What do you do about those? You advocate. If it doesn't meet those minimum standards, then you can use this advocacy document that I put together, kind of some scripting, to contact your publisher or your vendor and ask for accessible versions. So tell them, your stuff doesn't meet the requirements. My students need accessible documents. I need accessible files, and what you have isn't good enough. And ask them to do the work. Ask them to give you an accessible version. If they're not going to provide an accessible version for you, you can request permission to adapt it. This might require getting a PDF that isn't protected. Most of them are, and that can cause a problem. But if they'll send you a PDF that's had the protections removed so that you can convert that to a Word document and improve the accessibility, that's your second option. If they're not going to do any of that, put a note in your catalog. Note the fact that you did ask, that you asked them for an accessible version, you asked them to let you make it accessible, and they denied those attempts. You want that for kind of in case you get sued because these items aren't accessible, you've got documentation that you are aware of it and you tried to get a better version and it is on the publisher or vendor that it wasn't provided. Also, if you make that a note that's viewable to your students or library users, you're letting them know, we thought about you. We advocated for you. We knew this was something that was going to be a problem and we tried to fix it. Sometimes just knowing that people are actually thinking about you makes a huge difference. And I'm not going to spend too much time on it. It's something you can download and use if you find it useful. But I've got the citations here so that you can show them exactly, this is the law that you are not complying with. I've got a link to those standards so you can tell them exactly what they are doing that's not good enough and how it needs to be better. And I've got just some scripting on how to phrase that so that you can, have that with you when you're on the phone with them. And then just a reminder of what you're asking for, an accessible version or permission to adapt. And if they say no, then what? Try and find it somewhere else. If you can't, if it has to be that item through that vendor, put your notes in the catalog. Just got a few more minutes, so the final things I want to leave you with: accessibility whenever possible. Whether you are creating or sharing or selecting, make it accessible. Adapt it whenever it isn't accessible. And whenever you can't adapt, advocate for your students as much as you can. Again, that Google folder has the accessibility checklist. It has that advocating for accessibility document. It also has a list of references for this presentation, but also just some great reading if you would like more information about this. So that's it. I've got about 8 minutes left in this meeting. So if you have any questions, anything else I can help you with. Oh, okay, yes. So the auto caption option. It's not going to take your alt text and generate a caption. It has automatic options for both the alt text and the caption separately. What it's going to do is Word is going to generate an AI version that is almost always awful. So I would not recommend using your auto caption. As with most AI things, if it's a picture of a cat, AI seems to be pretty good with cat. It's going to get that. If it's a complex graph, the best you're going to get is it's a graph. If you even get that, you might get it's some lines. So avoid the auto caption or auto alt text. Same thing, just kind of throwing it out there for your social media posts. So pretty much every social media platform allows for embedding alt text, and most of them give you like an auto-generate option. That's almost always awful. So don't use it. That's tough, Mary. Legally, 100% of what you put up for students has to be accessible. I don't think anyone is anywhere close to actually meeting that standard. Start with what you can do with the staff that you have and make sure that you are prioritizing the accessibility of new items. Do what you can with the staff that you have. Yes, Lisa, you can't just say, oh, we don't have the staff for that. You have to at least be showing that you are doing as much as you can with the staff that you have and that you are not putting up new items that you know don't meet the standards. So if you have to prioritize something, prioritize new items you're putting up, because it's sort of, once you're aware of it, if you continue to do it, you're no longer acting in good faith. In terms of real-time e-learning, a lot of it is your slide development. So make sure that your fonts are carefully chosen, your color contrast, that you put the visual descriptions under any images that you use on your slides. Keep in mind, not to put the full URLs on your slides. The biggest problem I have with things like Zoom is you don't have the option for real-time captions unless you have someone who's willing to sit there and type in real-time captions. I would love for every type of online meeting or presentation to have at least the less than perfect AI generated real-time captions, but record your stuff, go back, caption it later. Mary, I've heard that Google offers that. I didn't know that Office 365 did as well. I'm very excited. I haven't used them yet, but I'm very excited about these real-time options. That is kind of a last-minute thing, I would say. If you are in an institution where you don't have an accessibility team, or even if you do have an accessibility team, reach out to other professionals in that field. So we have a consulting service that we send all of our documents to just to have another set of eyes on it. And they employ a lot of people with disabilities who can actually, real life test these items for us. So don't feel like you have to do it all yourself. Find those other professionals, especially if you have a student with accessibility needs. Ask them how it's working. Ask them what you could be doing better. Ask them how they're actually using your files. That could make a world of difference in what you prioritize and how you do it. Hope that this helps, and I hope that, if not making experts, I'm at least getting enough people to be thinking about digital accessibility so that they can start to discuss it with their faculty in their libraries. On the screen is email, Twitter, and my professional site. Feel free to contact me with any other questions. Thank you very much.